Dear all, I am Ville Vuolanto, Senior Lecturer in History and Latin Language at Tampere University, Finland. I assume I will be here tackling with much of the same questions as Simon before in this session, but from the viewpoint of premodern childhood. I will start with some rather general theoretical points on agency, then proceed to a simple example from antiquity, and then introduce experience and the concept of community of experience before entering into some conclusions. In the academia, we face ever-changing set of styles and fashions, and the concept of agency certainly has evolved into one of the most commonly used methodological concepts among the scholars of childhood and children. More that research would use any concept, more there developed different interpretations of what this concept would mean. Simultaneously, the everyday connotations of the concept and its analytical use would easily conflate. Agency, in ordinary talk for example, seems to connect with autonomous will and action, opposite of life predetermined by structures. For this reason, agency may be seen as an unsuitable concept for understanding childhood in the remote past. Without doubt, the actors of the past, like children, may have had many restraints, but this is, after all, a difference in degree, not of kind. Thus, not our own experiences, actions and reactions, strategies and hopes inevitably depend on many limitations and on particular historical contexts. There is always the prison inside of which an individual makes choices and acts. Agency is also often combined with the idea of historical change. I have also often noticed an ideal, sometimes explicit, often implicit, that agency should imply historically significant actions. These, in turn, are easily reduced to historical change, where, moreover, historical seem often to mean an impact on the progress of society and culture. Therefore, to protest would always be better and more agentic than simply reproducing the social life, and in fact, this reproduction and acting for continuity is seldom understood as agentic by behavior at all. We, as historians living under the influence of modernity, tend, therefore, to seek for promoters of change and deviations from the cultural and social norms in history. How could it represent an occasion of agency to do as you were expected to do? Can there be agency in obeying your parents to go to bed on time, to work on family field, or to study as you are told to do? Indeed, what I think should be relevant for the concept of agency should not be change, but choice. For there being a possibility of choosing, an individual needs to have been experiencing and interpreting their situation consciously, and there would have been some kind of intention or goal in the subsequent reaction. That is, there has been a choice, an ability to act differently, a possibility of making a difference, as Anthony Giddens has put it. If we, therefore, hold agency which aims at survival, adaptation, and compliancy in social interaction secondary, we undermine the scope for social and cultural agency. On the other hand, without linking agency to intentionality and to at least some kind of goal seeking, the concept loses its conceptual and interpretative power. That is, focusing to choices instead of changes would keep agency a fruitful concept in historical studies. This view of agency would hinder us from undermining the culture of children and makes us to take their actions and the limits of such agency seriously. This, of course, would require that we would be willing to accept that having significance and making a difference in one everyday interaction and relationships inside the family and in local community would be enough, and that this significance is assessed through children's own experience and own culture, not through the adult world in which we live in. In what follows, I have selected a passage from a late antique text to illustrate what the perspective of agency can bring in for analyzing premodern evidence. The text I have selected is in no way particular. It is written by an older, educated man of some 55 years, memorizing his own childhood and youth some 45 years ago previously, and it consists of only some sentences. In all these factors, then, the situation is unfortunately fairly normal and difficult for a historian of childhood and children of this period. The short text is written by Jerome, a scholar and theologian in 402 BCE, probably in Bethlehem. Jerome, as well as his audience, belonged to the educated minority sharing the literary culture of the Roman world of the 4th century CE. And now I read you the text, which is also there in the slide. Which of us does not remember his infancy? I shall make you laugh. How I ran about among the offices where the slaves worked, how I spent the holidays in play, or how I had to be dragged like a captive from my grandmother's lap to the lessons of my enraged Arbelius, that is my schoolmaster. And that's all. Can we now extract childhood agency from this? Playing and running, as well as enraged schoolmasters, belong to the stock themes in depictions of childhood in the Roman world. In a way, they need to be mentioned in order the narrative to be culturally relatable. Running around and playing were signs to attach these memories to recognizable childhood. And in fact, in constructing early childhood as a background for the study, they were needed to convey the idea of memorization of the past across the decennia. Enraged or violent schoolmaster, in turn, was a much used literary motif, which here is used also to tie Jerome's childhood in the right social status group, the educated elites, who shared the Greco-Roman paideia with a reference to Horace, together with the common experiences as one-time students. This link is further highlighted in the text just after the passage cited here, when Jerome refers to his dream. He had a dream in which he had returned to practice declamation with his teacher in rhetoric, and when he woke up, when woken up, Jerome claims to have congratulated himself of not actually needing to make the speech. We are left with a mentioning of running taking place among the slaves' little closets. It seems there are no specific cultural reasons for mentioning this, except for the rhetorical aim of highlighting the vividness of the memory. This is a way of tying the scene with a specific everyday environment. There arises the inevitable question about the veracity of such statements. Jerome claims to have experienced something in his childhood. We have only his words for this. The whole story might well have been invented based on what Jerome assumed about the shared cultural background. And after some 45 years or so, can we in any way consider we are hearing here the voice of a child or a young person? Jerome's point is to claim that he has good memory and can remember this and that about his childhood and education. For his argument to be culturally valid and rhetorically efficient, he must offer to his audience plausible memories, those which can be related with. The selection of these memories should be plausible and suiting his purpose. Therefore, he needs to imagine what kind his reader's community of experience might have been, that is, which kind of experiential, educational, and emotional background and discursive universe they had shared. However, if Jerome is lying or invents or simply colors his memories ad hoc, what difference it would actually make for our interpretation of his text. If taking this as a true memory, true in a heavy quotation marks, it is still but an anecdote concerning of an individual. But in both cases, let the anecdote be invented or based on an historical event, it takes part in the shared social world of Jerome and his audience, both constructing and reflecting upon a view of childhood, which has to be plausible for the contemporary circumstances. This is especially true as the very point in Jerome's story is not as such in those particles we are interested in. For him, these pointedly belong to the background, merely adding to the plausibility of his not too delicate main point. We indeed remember many particulars from our childhood. In Jerome's telling, children were running among the closets of the slaves, not an adult-sanctioned playground as such, but an everyday space in connection of a wealthy late Roman household. Potentially, this involved also independent social contacts with the slaves themselves, as well as bonding with other children. A child could also cherish his nearness to grandmother spontaneously, even in a case the child should have been studying. We see here also a reference to resistance, child being able to show his emotions and needing to be dragged from his grandmother to start his studies. Indeed, we have here a child interacting with his environment, with his choices and actions based on his experiences. This agency is not characteristic merely to a single child, but it shows what choices there were available in contemporary social interaction. As a historian, I have only these outwards acts to analyze the one-time choices the individuals have had. As the narrative of Jerome shows, it would be fair to claim that the historian of antiquity would rather see limits or boundary conditions for the children's agency than agency itself. The community, with its culture-specific norms, values, material environment, and practices in social interaction, that is, the cultural scripts available, would determine what kind of playground is available and bestows the agents with rules and equipment. This would also set the frame in which the experiences, about which we of course can have no direct information, in which the experiences are interpreted and ultimately acted out, which sometimes would mean they were narrated. A particle mode of being and acting is characteristic for any specific intersection of gender, age, social group, stage of life course, religion, ethnicity, and historical time. So here it seems to be useful to introduce a concept of community of experience. Behind this concept is the fact that communal identity with the specific cultural and social circumstances and discourses define the limits in which the interpretation and processing of individual experiences take place. The concept of community of experience has previously been used to denote a community, the members of which would share the same experience. But here I would develop the concept in a different direction in claiming that the community in fact also produced the very ways in which any particular sensory input is experienced. This is not in the first place question of shared experiences, but how the individuals interpret and narrate what they have experienced, both for themselves and for their environments. There are, as the social world framework states, discursive universes, that is, shared relational discursive spaces. And these limit and direct the ways in which individuals and groups can interpret and conceptualize their experiences. As Aldous Huxley pointed out, experience is not what happens to a man, it is what a man does with what happens to him. And from this perspective, agency is a response to the experiences, both interpreted and handled with the tools allowed and determined by the contemporary discursive universe. The story told by Jerome is therefore connected to a way a certain community of experience. The story told by Jerome is therefore connected to a way a certain community of experience conceptualizes the social world. It is drawing from a certain shared idea of the repertories of action that are used by children, repertories which are depending on the culturally and socially determined limits in which the experiences can be interpreted and responded. Jerome wanted to crystallize his memories of childhood into quite opposite experiences. First, there was the childhood as a period of freedom, roaming around and playing. Here, he only implicitly refers to possibility of social contacts in play and among the slaves. Secondly, there are the negative experiences connected with schooling and the need of tearing him to take his lessons, the reference to stern and even frightening teachers, and later also the awkwardness, even anxiety connected to practicing public speeches. These problems in pedagogical methods of the day were countered by his grandmother, who was to offer safety, or at least in the narrative of Jerome, the grandmother represented the experience of nearness and solace. His narrative refers to emotions or states of mind linked with childhood. Freedom, fear, safety, nearness, and anxiety. He assumes these experiences would offer his audiences points of identification, and thus they would relate to his memories with amusement and sympathy. Moreover, the social interaction which features in the story needs to be pointed out. The other actors mentioned to have been in contact with the child were grandmothers and teachers, explicitly so, and together with implicitly mentioning playmates and slaves. Instead, there are no references to parents nor to any other members of the family. The time would not allow me to go deeper in this, but I still need maybe here to point out that we cannot make here the conclusion that the nuclear family would not have been important in late antiquity. As pointed out, many features in Jerome's narrative were commonplaces. There is no need to take the acts as narrated in the sources as representing the actual choices made by the individual in question. Still, by paying attention to the social interaction and community of experience alongside with the focus on agency, it is possible to study in which ways the protagonists have first interpreted and then used their past experiences. We might not get information on certain individual children's agency or experiences, but this should not hinder us from asking questions about impact and meanings of childhood, as well as on construction of agency, experience, identity, and subjectivity, and thus from trying to reconstruct something of the world in which this took place. I thank you for your attention.